Hello everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing the Prophet 6 desktop module, but from here on out I'm going to be referring to it as the Prophet 6. To skip to me playing and to hear the sounds of it without talking, click ahead to the time mentioned above. Okay. So, my initial thoughts on the Prophet 6, well, I love it. If anybody's getting the gist of this channel by now, they should know that I don't review synthesizers I do not love dearly. So, let's get some of the negative things out of the way. It being a voltage control oscillator, and based on the circuitry inside of it, there are technical issues that a lot of people have been experiencing with the Prophet 6 and the OB6 as of late. I reached out to Sequential because I had a issue with parameters not responding to my touch, and also parameters randomly changing on their own. Once the module heated up, it worked fine. Well, it being a new purchase, I simply had it exchanged, but from what Sequential told me, if anybody's having these sorts of issues, you simply need to take it apart and reseat the ribbon controller. So that seems to be a QA/QC issue, which is always subject to human error. I am a technician, so I am very understanding of these sorts of things. They do happen. Components do fail. Long story short, I have a Prophet 6 module in my possession now that works flawlessly. So that's the negative stuff. Let's get to the positive stuff. It sounds beautiful. It is the continuation of the Prophet 5 legacy. Come full circle. 40 years later, the Prophet 6 is released. Now, I just got mine recently. This came out about 5 years ago, so yeah, I may be 5 years behind the curve. It doesn't matter. It is a timeless sound. It is a timeless sound canvas that can be used for a wide range of synth applications. As many of you know, I have a Prophet Rev 2, I have a Phantom 7, I have a Roland JX3P, among other synthesizers, and it complements and completes my collection. I consider myself at maximum as far as the synthesizers I need to create the pieces that I want to create. Now, a lot of adjectives are thrown around describing the sounds. Creamy, warm, three-dimensional, brassy, warm, and all of those apply. But for those of you who are watching this review, trying to decide between a Prophet 6 and a Rev 2 and or an OB6, well, maybe I can be of some assistance, or maybe I can just leave you with more questions. If any of you have seen my Prophet Rev 2 review, you already know how much I love that synthesizer. And no, I will not be getting rid of my Prophet Rev 2. The way people argue back and forth between digital controlled oscillator versus voltage controlled oscillator becomes kind of a silly self-defeating game to me. Dave Smith said it himself. One doesn't simply sound better than the other. They are different. They sound different from each other, with a lot of overlap and similarities in between those differences. The biggest difference, sound-wise, that you hear is not necessarily in the oscillators themselves, but in the way the filter interacts with the voltage-controlled oscillator. That is where you hear the difference. If I had to get into one specific thing about the filter, is that, well, the Curtis filter is a little bit more extreme, and its resonance has a narrower bandwidth, a narrower sweet spot. The resonance on the Prophet 6 rings out with more harmonics, and it's not as noisy and as piercing. That's not to say the filter is better on the Prophet 6, although I can see why many would just say it's better. It is different. And you can make different sounds with different filters. there. I hope I've cleared that. The OB6 was on my radar for a while as well, and one of my good friends owns the OB6. I get to play it often. It is a phenomenal synthesizer, and I cannot say that the Prophet 6 is better than the OB6, or that the OB6 is better than the Prophet 6. It is how you interact with the instrument that's going to ultimately help you decide what's going to be your best bet. Some people buy all of the Dave Smith instruments, all of the sequential keyboards. You can't blame them there. If you have the money, go ahead. But if you're like me and you work hard for your money and you're not rich, then you really want to narrow down what's going to suit you. And did I need the Prophet 6? No. I can get very close to the Prophet 6 sound with a Rev 2. However, since having the Prophet 6, I see what the capabilities are with that. There's a vibe to it. There's a vibration to it. It's something you feel more than you hear. You feel it. And I will say, where the Prophet 6 trumps any other synthesizer that I own is in the feeling you get from interacting with it and playing it. The sounds can be very similar, but when you're in the room hearing the vibrations yourself and controlling them in real time, there is an impact it has on you individually. And that's where the Prophet 6 really shines. It's like an X factor, dare I say, magical connection that you have. That can be achieved with other synthesizers as well. But the way I like to play my keyboards is I like to have them orchestrated. Each one has its specific role to play, just like the instruments in an orchestra. Maybe you could try to play the lowest note on a violin to match or mimic a cello, but ultimately, if you want a cello sound, you play a cello. Or if you want a cello sound, you play it on a Roland Phantom, like I do sometimes. Or East-West plugins. I use those quite a bit too. And I'm going to start reviewing plugins as well, because plugins play a big role in a lot of the music I'm making these days, and I'm sure a lot of the music you're making as well. So the Prophet 6, to me, is a love letter. It's a love letter from the past to the present. The Prophet 5, for all intents and purposes, was the first proper polyphonic analog synthesizer. Proper meaning, to me, it has presets, digital memory, parameters can be stored, multiple voices at once, more than 4 voices. One of the things that irks me the most is 4-note polyphony. 5 to 6 minimum. 6 is perfect. 6 is the sweet spot. If you're going to give me 4 notes of polyphony, now I can only play 1 bass note and a triad. Or I can play chords with fourths, with an extension of a 7th. I can play some interesting chords, but not as interesting as I'd like. So 6 notes seems to me to be the minimum that I need. I've never played a Prophet 5, and I've never played a keyboard with 5-note polyphony, but 4 drives me nuts. That's why I had to get rid of my MS-2000 back in the day. Oddly enough, if you give me a mono synth, I'm fine. If I know there's only 1 voice, I can deal with that. Anyway, the Prophet 5 started it all, in my opinion, as far as the sound of the late 70s, 80s, and onward. Prophet 5 has been numerous hit records. So many that I can't rattle them off right now. I'm sure you already know half of them, or have heard at least half of them in your lifetime. And what's great is one of the original sound designers and team members of Sequential, John Bowen, actually recreated the original Prophet 5 presets and put them on the Prophet 6, and they sound fantastic. Really, really good. I'm not a preset guy. I always have to make my own sounds, but there are a lot of presets on the Prophet 6 that I am going to use, that they're perfect already. I also have a lot of my own patches, and you're going to hear them in the review when I play later on. Now, comparing it to something like a Rev 2 or a Novation Summit or a Phantom, it doesn't have all the functionality. Everything is very much in your face. All the parameters is knob per function. There's no menu diving at all whatsoever. You're dealing with one low frequency oscillator, which on paper sounds pretty limiting. But it's not just one low frequency oscillator. You also have features like polymodulation, or polymod they call it, where you can use one of the oscillators as a low frequency oscillator. You can use oscillator 2 to control oscillator 1, yielding some very interesting sonic results. There's a type of sound that you can get with those unique features that are very unique to the Prophet 6 and Prophet 5, and they sound beautiful. I can't stress enough how much love seems to have been put into designing and building this synthesizer. In fact, just reading the manual right here, I'm not going to read it for you. You can download it. But under a few words of thanks, Dave Smith really lets everybody know how much this instrument means to him and the history behind it and the love put into it. It's a one-of-a-kind device to own. I can't recommend it enough. So for those of you out there going, Prophet 6, OB6, Rev 2, what do I get? Well, what kind of music do you want to make? Me personally, if I had to choose one right now, I would still have to stick with the Rev 2. Shocking, even to me. That could change depending on the music I make in the future, depending on all kinds of things. The Prophet 6 could easily become the Desert Island synth. And the reason why I say is you got to ask yourself, what kind of music do you want to make? The Rev 2, it can emulate those old-fashioned Prophet OB type of sounds, but it can also do a lot more. It can make these crazy sound effects, and I think very modern. And when I say modern sounds, synth sounds that don't emulate a genre from the past, but perhaps hint at a genre of the future, or even of the present time. That being said, I don't think the Prophet 6 is a strictly vintage-only machine either. The Prophet 6 can also be considered a modern synth, and modern sounds can be created on it, particularly when you couple it with outboard effects. But even on its own, it's a very diverse synthesizer. I love it very, very much. So without further ado, I'm going to stop yapping, and I'm going to take you into the synth studio, and as usual, play you some of my favorite customized sounds and preset patches. Let's go. Here she is, the Prophet 6 desktop module. Come around here. We've got all sorts of goodies here. Here's oscillator 1. You got your triangle, saw, pulse with pulse width. Same on oscillator 2. Okay, you got your one low frequency oscillator here. Triangle, sawtooth, rev, saw, reverse saw, square, and random. Here's all the different parameters that can be affected by the low frequency oscillator. Lots and lots of choices. You got your analog distortion, 2 separate effects, dual effects. I'm a big fan of the phaser and the flangers on here, as well as the bucket brigade delay. Your oscillator mixer section with your sub octave that you can throw in for that juicy, bouncy bass tone. Of course, you got your high pass filter here and your low pass filter, as well as your standard friends, your amplifier envelope and your filter envelope. Aftertouch is very customizable. And here's your polymod section that can affect the modulation via the filter envelope or via oscillator 2. Pulse width 1, filter, low pass, high pass, and or both. Lots can be done here. And I gotta say, the more I play this Prophet 6, the more I fall in love with it. It could end up being my main squeeze. You can see how easily I can start with a sound like this and then just get into tweaking it, baby. You know? Dig in. So let's go to some of my sounds, because why not? I've only made about 30 or so, but I'm happy with them. That's the Rev 2, not the Prophet 6. Force a habit. Now let's throw some effects on here. We got a little bit of phaser, a little bit of delay. Okay, so Sound 24 utilizes the polymod, and specifically the way it utilizes it is doing a unique effect where the oscillator 2 is adding some movement as well as the low frequency oscillator. This breathes life into sounds so well. You'll notice that as I go up the keyboard, you can't see me playing the keyboard, but as I go up the scale, the frequency increases, and that's because as you're going up the scale, the pitch, music, that's the way music and pitch works. The further up the scale you go, the higher the frequency. But in this case, this isn't being used to make any of the notes, it's being used to modulate each of the notes of oscillator 1. So if I play a note here, really cool stuff. Always have to dig in, right guys? If you want to dig it, you need to dig in.